Dr. Simeon Hein, and he is the author of Dark Matter Monsters, Cryptids, Ball Lightning, and the Science of Secret Lifeforms. And this is the type of topic I love. And oddly enough, I've even talked about it before in the past. Thanks for coming on again. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me here today.
Great. So, I mean, the first question I always ask everybody is like, what got you into this? Like you're a statistics professor, doctor, and
Right.
you're writing books about cryptids and consciousness. So
It's a good question. People that go into academics were looking to really find evidence, ideas, and truth. Reality, the way it really is. And you prepare yourself through years of graduate school training that things may not work out the way you thought they would. Right. When you start a project, you may come to a conclusion that's different than what you thought when you started. And that's sort of why you have a dissertation committee there, is they're kind of want to see if you have an objective perspective, if you're willing to look at ideas that may go against what you personally like to believe in, if you're willing to look at what the data show versus what you wanted it to show. And that's really the process you go through in academics and in other fields too, also in law and other areas like that, where it's a process of coming to the truth by looking at all the available evidence. And there's some way that you assemble the information about what conclusion you come to at the end. So when I came across the idea, I heard someone talk about something called remote viewing in 1996. There was a part of my mind, having just gone through graduate school, I was an assistant professor even for a semester after that, in statistics. I came across this idea that didn't seem plausible to me at the beginning, but having been through, graduate school, having gotten a PhD, I realized there may be things out there that you didn't know about at first, that when you really look at the evidence, I'm not talking like a superficial cursory look at the evidence, like we're all used to now from the internet and from social media, where, there's something pitched, an idea, and, you don't spend a huge amount of time looking into it. It's just sort of something that goes by your feed. It looks interesting. We're talking about taking years of your life and looking at something, going to the library a lot like we used to before the age of the internet, really studying something, looking at the evidence. It's a painstaking process, but that's what society's investing in you, a lot of energy and time to become a doctor of something, an expert, right? And so when I encountered the idea of remote viewing, I really didn't believe that the average person had natural psychic ability. I was open to the idea that maybe they're special people we had seen on TV and those TV shows from the 80s and 90s, where they'd have those women psychics working with police detectives, solving, crimes and things like this. And so when I took a class in it in 1996 at a place called the Farsight Institute, I was really surprised that I was getting information that was not revealed to me yet. It would be a target hidden in a folder. It was more accurate than it should have been based on the statistics. I sort of had a sense of, if you're just guessing at the colors and the shapes and the sizes of any particular target, any particular thing, you would expect to get some of it correct just from guessing. But I could see from the results in a few days that I was getting, and other people in the class were getting, more accuracy, more target contact, as it's called, than they would have been if it was a really random process. In statistics, you just start out with the idea that there's these random processes out there, and it's up to you to prove that there's some correlation there or even causation. So we're used to the idea that there's nothing really going on out of the ordinary, but remote viewing showed me there was something going on that I couldn't explain, that was beyond my conscious mind.
I took a remote viewing course with he was one of my guests, David Morehouse, and he wrote the remote viewing handbook, and worked with SRI and all of that. And when I took his course, it was online, but I was with 20 other people, and I was completely blown away by how accurate that information came through. So I
It's really
I totally relate like how that can bring your perspective like to something new.
it can. It really can. And here's another thing I learned from remote viewing. Before I got into all these other topics, your conscious mind has a bias towards the way you were brought up to believe about reality. So there could be things going on around you that you don't see, even on a piece of paper on a desk in front of you, that you don't see until you're done with it and you look at it objectively to see that you did something that shouldn't have been possible from just a null hypothesis point of view. You're doing something that nobody told you existed, but the proof is right on the page in front of you, unless there's some trick going on. There's some subliminal sound telling you the target in your ear, but you're not consciously hearing it. Your mind starts coming up with these counter explanations that might explain it if it wasn't what it appears to be, which is some sort of psychic phenomena. So this is what RV also taught me, Gary, is we don't really know what reality we're in. What we know is a story we were taught since we were very, very young.
Absolutely.
From nursery school, from our parents onward, as soon as we could speak, right? And it's reinforced over every day you go to school, every day you go to work. It's this story of reality.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we experience is a story, but there's a big possibility that story doesn't really match up with reality as much as we think it does. And there's really big gaps. And are we as adults willing to look at the evidence? Do we actually look at evidence, or do we just look at that evidence that we think supports what we already believe, which gets back to that bias tendency? And there's a lot of biases in our thinking, in our mind, right? There's a consistency bias. We like to confirmation bias. We like things that confirm what we already believe because it makes our ego feel comfortable. And so the real hallmark of science is, can you look at evidence that does not confirm what you believed before and have the perspective to come to a conclusion that was different than what you initially thought? And that's how this all starts for me. Now, one more thing, let me bring this in. Even during graduate school, I came across something called chaos theory in sociology. It wasn't from sociologists, it was from other grad students, because in the mid 80s, this idea of chaos theory, small changes creating large effects, that was something that was coming to the forefront in sciences, physical sciences. There was the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico and other places that were, because of the advent of computers, were looking into this idea called chaos theory, which meant that things were not necessarily linear, which means even if you turn the knob a little bit, you're not going to get just a small increase or decrease. It could cause this chaotic bifurcation into a whole nother realm of attraction, as it was called, domain of attraction. And that led to the idea of fractal geometry. And fractal objects, as many people know, back then it was sort of new because of computers. We could create fractals on our early computers back then, right? Which are self-similar scale invariant objects like trees and clouds and mountain ranges and rivers and the way nature really looks. So I come across this idea of fractal geometry, and fractals, the definition of fractals are objects between dimensions. Not from a paranormal point of view, from a mathematical point of view, objects between dimensions. So I was open to the idea, even in graduate school, though I had never heard of these topics that I'm familiar with now, that there could be processes that science hadn't tackled in my field of sociology because they weren't linear, they didn't fit, and they were between dimensions. And I wasn't even sure what that would look like, but it's sort of what I wrote my dissertation about before my knowledge of these topics that I'm very familiar with now, or more familiar with, was that there could be phenomena there, even in the ordinary world, that you really didn't understand because they weren't linear or evenly shaped Euclidean shaped objects, that they were irregular, that they were jagged, scale invariant, like fractals are. And they can exist just like mountain ranges and clouds and trees do, but they don't fit in ordinary geometry and math that we're familiar with.
You just said so much. One of the things that you mentioned, that was the first thing I want to, reality. Like we only know what we're told. You
Right.
know, and one of the things that kind of comes up with me is that too is the whole observer effect. You know, maybe I'm observing this because I was told this, but it's
Right.
not actually what it is. It is.
Exactly. We have these biases. And I find as a sociologist that most people don't really have an open mind to anything that they weren't taught was real somewhere along the line by authority figures in their life. And we know that this is very serious in terms of how societies work, and our society in particular. I mean, it creates things like racism and discrimination because we don't treat people for who they are. We have this sort of image of who they are based on how we were brought up and the type of people we were brought up around. So we always see the people who are other than us, who are different from us. We don't see them the same way as the people we grew up around. And we're all familiar with this. I mean, the United States is a big experiment. Is can we all learn to get along together from different nationalities, from different backgrounds? We're very different than other countries. And I think we have an openness in this country, in the United States, to and other countries, you know, North America overall. There's a lot of diversity, and we're open to the idea that maybe there's a legal process that we can follow to, you know, to reach a sense of fairness and truth that isn't based on where we're coming from initially, but on the objectivity of the process. And if you believe in that, you have to believe in things that are going on right now, like UFO disclosure and all these other topics that we're interested in, because you realize you don't know what's going on until you look at the evidence. That's how we believe it in our modern perspective as modern Western people. I mean, wouldn't you agree with that?
Absolutely,
That's,
100%. I agree with you.
we're evidence-based people.
Mm-hmm.
And that challenges our biases. And it's all very, for me, it's still to this day, I get up every day. It's extremely challenging to realize that things are not at all like I used to think they were. I mean, I don't know how long it takes to understand reality. I'm over a half a century old at this point, and I'm just learning about things that I realize have been going on the whole time, and I didn't know about it until very recently.
I'm about the same age, and I still just am too. I don't have a clue of what is. It's the most basic question, right? What is this experience I'm having? And I can't answer it. I
No,
cannot
we don't
answer
know.
that question. And it should be like the easiest question in the world. Like most people would just say, "Oh yeah, I'm just sitting at a desk talking to someone." But is that what it really is?
I know how you feel. That's how I feel every day too. And it's funny, it's people like you and me, as we get older, we realize, and maybe it's healthy, do we know less and less? The stories we were taught as younger people are mythologies that societies create. Is it to create stability? Societies create these to create continuity. It's not a bad thing. It's a limiting thing because no one ever told me about remote viewing or UFOs or cryptids or any of these topics that now really consume my focus every day. No one told me about that the whole time from kindergarten to PhD, 27 years. I was in school continuously for 27 years, took courses in every subject matter you could imagine, passed, got my PhD, you know? And I have to say, I don't think that our formal educational processes really, they're teaching you how to think, but they don't really know what reality is either.
No.
It's just a process of learning,
Categorizing almost is what we're doing.
categorizing, memorization, a kind of way of ranking people in society by how well they play the game. How well can you repeat the paradigm that we're teaching you? That's sort of what it is. And thank goodness we have had people in our history like Einstein and Copernicus and Galileo and many other people that we would call scientists now, even though back then they were just called natural philosophers. We call them scientists now, and who literally looked at things and said, wait a minute, wait, hold on a second. It isn't that way. It's this way. We reevaluate, and every 100 years or so, we have this huge reevaluation of the entire paradigm. And people don't want to do it. They go through it kicking and screaming. The institutions push back. In the olden days, they would burn you at the stake. That doesn't happen anymore, but you could, you know, lose your job. You could be blackmailed by your employers, right? Pilots, think of pilots and UFO sightings, people who see things in law enforcement that don't fit our sense of reality of creatures that are supposed to exist, things like this. And so it puts all those people in a very challenging position. Now, I think it's the job of scientists to objectively look at all of this information. And I think we're starting to do that right now and say, well, wait a minute, maybe there are UFOs, UAP up in the atmosphere. Maybe they're here a lot. We just had, we're doing this interview on a day where the ODNI report was finally released 2 months late, right? I just had a chance to look at it before we're talking
I
here.
haven't
And
seen
they
it yet.
said, well, here we go again. They said we have 515 new incidents that we have learned about since our last report. Well, I don't know if it's total both reports or since the last report, but now that they said we can only explain about 2/3 of them. 171 cases, we have no idea what they are. I mean, they don't fit. They're not clutter. They're not plastic bags. They're not ice crystals. They're none of those. It's something we can't explain. And so maybe we are opening up again, but it's serious because, you know, if you know people have experienced these events, what we're doing is creating a class of people who are been stigmatized and are traumatized by their experiences sometimes and don't know where to talk about this to when they've had experiences with things that go beyond our ordinary definition of reality. So I think it's actually a more serious issue than we've been led to believe. I think there are a lot of witnesses out there to a range of phenomena that don't come forward because they're afraid of the ridicule that they're going to receive.
So do you have a hypothesis of what this reality is and what it is we are experiencing and why?
My feeling about it is more that our consciousness is something that's permanent, but it goes through huge numbers of changes. And some of it, while we're in this form as a human being, takes the form of a human experience. But what that means is that reality is absolutely huge and you could encounter anything. And it doesn't fit the human story that you were taught. I mean, there's literally things out there that you could experience that nobody you've ever talked to in your life understands. Do you realize how serious that is? We just assume somebody out there knows, right? Especially when we're younger.
Yeah, we hope so. We hope that they know.
Somebody will take care of it. Somebody's responsible, right? It'll be the Air Force. It'll be law enforcement. So somebody will deal with it. But as you get older, like we are, you realize, no, it is real. What it is society has like this immune response, a social immune response to new things. And it attacks them like our immune system. It's a social belief immune system. And rather than dealing with reality, we attack the people that say they've experienced it because it's a threat to the paradigm. We end up repeating this same activity day in, day out, socially and politically, because we're afraid to deal with what's really out there. And so it's like we're the drunks underneath the street light looking for our keys because that's where the light is. That's where the light shines.
It's such a crazy visual of like every person on the planet sort of cattled and herded up because we don't want to look at the truth.
No, but I don't think we do. Because we all know someone who's experienced it. We all know someone who's experienced something that shouldn't exist by the way we were brought up.
I've experienced a lot of things that shouldn't have existed.
A lot of things. And every night we go to sleep, we experience something we don't really understand, right? Dreams.
Yeah.
So we're all experiencing the unknown every day anyway. It's just how much courage do we have to go into that unknown and see if we can make sense of it in any possible way without just reacting to it and denying it. There's a knee-jerk reaction to deny these phenomena, all of them. And so it's just how we are. Our first instance is just it's like a rubber band effect, as some people call it. The rubber band always wants to go back to the position it was in. And our mind has this boggle point. It doesn't want to go past a certain point. But what happens if reality is changing and more people are experiencing these phenomena? Even in the ODNI report, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which I looked at, this morning since it was released, they say that the reports are on the rise. So it could be that it's not as constant as it looks. In other words, just as we get changes in global temperatures, changes in magnetism and positions of the poles, solar flares. They're large scale things that change over periods of years and decades.
Yes.
CO2 concentration of the atmosphere, which you can look back in history, has these huge 1,000-year cycles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our minds don't really do well dealing with 1,000-year cycles. We're just like looking forward. We're like mammals looking forward. What's going to happen in the next hour? What's happening tomorrow? But, if you look at these big patterns, you have to ask yourself, are there some other constants in our universe that are slowly changing and may open the doors to these other realities? And all of a sudden we start experiencing more of it, more bleed through. So to answer your question before you go to your next question, I think the reality we live in is a multiverse. We want to pretend it's a universe, but I think the reality is it's a multiverse, and that we live in a time-space continuum where other realities are also occurring that normally we don't have any interaction with, so we can pretend they don't exist. But they're here, and sometimes they bleed through. And just as we're surprised to see them pop into our reality, they might be surprised to see us pop into their reality. They may say, hey, what are you doing here, right?
Yeah.
From their point of view. And that's how I look at it, most objective way I can. That's what I think is going on.
That's the way I look
Parallel
at it.
realities.
I look at it too as a multiverse. My thing is, like, I think something became conscious. I didn't know why it was conscious. The only way it could figure out its own consciousness was to run through every probability and then take all that information back, and then it would know what it is. And so everything that's probable and possible exists all at one time,
right,
in order to have some kind of end major self revelation of an understanding of itself.
right. I think everything exists all at the same time, and where our minds break it down into this linear conscious time.
Yeah, just time's a tough one. Like we don't even really know what gravity is, right? We know it's a force, we know what it does, we know the results, we can measure it, but do we actually know what it is? I mean, that's kind of what's holding the particles and stuff together. So
right.
But we don't know.
Right. And that is sort of what led me to get into the topic of dark matter and write about it. Is, I came across this concept decades ago at the University of Arizona when I was getting my master's degree in sociology. The U of A was really good in astrophysics. So I'd go over to the planetarium at night. Once a week, they had some of the top experts probably in the world talking about astrophysics.
Wow.
You could go in, it was free. And this is a great break from graduate school, from dealing with all this kind of linear, normal regression statistics. And here they were talking about how little we know, which is, being honest, little we know about our own universe. And this is back in the 80s. I don't know if dark energy had been even discovered yet, or the idea of it. Dark matter had been postulated back then. And they, that was the idea, was that the vast majority of the matter in the universe isn't even visible to us. I mean, when you look around you, you think you see what's out there, but you don't. You're only seeing a tiny fraction, a couple percent maybe, of the energy and the material out there, because a lot of it's hidden. Even some of the ordinary matter is considered non-baryonic, which means it doesn't interact with light. Now, it just seems to me that if we know that there's 10 dark matter particles for every one ordinary particle of matter, there's probably 10 times as much life out there that's dark matter based versus our type of matter, which is visible. At least it's a reasonable thing to talk about. I mean, if we're outnumbered by dark matter 10-1 and dark energy 40-1, something like that, then there's other life that's not based on our particular biology, biochemical makeup, but should exist. And it's feasible, just like we interact with dark matter, as I write about it in Dark Matter Monsters, relic neutrinos from the cosmic background radiation. I mean, being at the U of A around astrophysics, I was fascinated. I almost wanted to switch departments from sociology to astrophysics, but I didn't. But I learned about this cosmic background radiation. Now we know it. We're interacting with it all the time. These relic neutrinos come in, they're 13 billion years old. 10 million a second are interacting with your body. They're not electromagnetic, they're neutrinos, but they create a pressure. They interact with dark matter and gravity. So we have like clues about what this is, even though we can't actually say what gravity is. We have models of it, but it's just it's a vast universe, even at just the idea of the universe. Forget the multiverse for a second. And the James Webb telescope, which just launched last fall, became active last fall. After it launched, it had to go ways out into the solar system. I think it detected its first exoplanet just a couple days ago. More planets out there, and so I think for anyone listening to this wondering how far does this go out about how much we don't know, what we do know is this: the universe in our human history, it's gotten bigger and bigger all the time. We used to think we were the only planet just 500 years ago. We were it. We were the central planet. Everything revolved around us. Oh, there were a couple other planets that were known, but we were like the main one, and everything else was secondary. There wasn't really any motion. There was nothing happening outside of the Earth. That was just 500 years ago. And now look, we're finding exoplanets, how many billions of light years away at the far edges of our own galaxy. So we do know one thing. We can be confident about this, Gary. Our sense of how small we are compared to the vastness of the universe, it keeps the proportions keep growing in terms of we're getting smaller relative to how big it is. So it's only a matter of time before we find out there's just bigger structures out there and more life and more things going on than our brain imagined in the beginning of this human journey.
It is, I mean, the idea that there's probably physical biological life forms on other planets, I think that's the obvious one. But I think also from your dark matter perspective too, is there's entities from like other dimensions or made of that other matter or made of neutrinos or whatever they're made of. There's these other conscious things. There's
neutrino-based life
think
forms.
about.
Why not? Yeah. That's why, so you asked me in the beginning, what's going on? We're a conscious entity that's created this form around us. William Tiller called it the bio bodysuit. William Tiller was this great researcher in subtle energy who I got to meet several times at conferences, who's now passed on. He had this idea of a reciprocal space. This got me thinking about it a long time, just listening to Bill Tiller. From the point of view of a physicist engineer, that there's this physical space we see, but he imagined in this same space we're in, there's a reciprocal space of energy that doesn't work. It connects things in ways you don't see physically, which was sort of interesting, right? Just to think about our space versus a D space.
Right. Yeah. Somebody explained that to me once. It's like a checkerboard.
Right. I think scientifically, these are all very defensible models, but if you take it to its full implications, it implies there's also other life out there that isn't, it's not based on direct space like we can see. It's in a reciprocal space. That doesn't mean it can't come into our space occasionally and we don't venture into its space while we're dreaming. It's just that this reality we see is just one of many realities. And even someone like Hugh Everett III at Princeton in the 50s proposed the relative states model, which that's what he called it, just to be on the safe side with his dissertation committee. It later became known as the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And Hugh Everett wasn't going out there on science fiction trying to make it more complex. He was trying to simplify quantum mechanics, this Schrodinger wave function, which describes, as you're saying, all these possibilities and probabilities for any group of particles, a wave function of probability. Well, Hugh asked a very basic question: are all these realities, if we're only seeing things look fairly stable to us as we look around in the spaces we're in, the colors are kind of stable from 1 minute to the next, right? The form, but that's not what quantum mechanics tells us it should be like. It should be oscillating. So he wondered where are the other descriptions of reality that the Schrodinger wave function describes? And his conclusion was that all the possibilities exist, and you and I are actually in all of these as other versions.
Yes.
We have a multiple description too. And boy, did he receive a lot of blowback from that, from none other than John Archibald Wheeler, who was, very famous physicist, worked in the Manhattan Project and worked with defense contractors. He had his own theories about gravity, by the way. He would have enjoyed your ideas about this, that gravity was really the fundamental thing in our universe. And he worked with Feynman, the Wheeler-Feynman hypothesis and so forth. But Wheeler was really afraid that Hugh Everett would tick off the Niels Bohr of the Copenhagen School in Denmark. Niels Bohr, who invented, the Bohr model of the atom and, the idea of the Copenhagen interpretation, among others who worked with him, that there's this particle wave duality. And that idea was that your consciousness sort of collapses this Schrodinger wave function. It creates what we've heard of as wave function collapse. And that was the idea that the only reason it looks like it does to us is all the other versions disappeared. It's called the disappearing worlds theory. But Hugh wanted to know, well, where do those disappearing worlds go if you and I don't perceive them? And the answer at the time was, well, they only exist when a human perceives them. But Hugh Everett, being the good scientist that he was, didn't buy that. He said that, well, what happens if a dog perceives, or does a dog collapse the wave function? Does a mouse? And Einstein had this favorite quote of his. He said, I can't believe the moon comes into existence when a mouse comes out of its hole at night and looks up at the moon. Then all of a sudden it exists. He goes back in the hole, disappears. Einstein wasn't buying it. And I personally, I think Einstein was right. I know it's popularly believed that he lost these debates with Bohr, the Einstein-Bohr debates, at these Solvay conferences. There were 5 of them, as far as I know, where all these great physicists of the time, can you imagine, got together and would have these types of conversations like we're having right now, but really try to make it sense in terms of physics, the best we could tell. That's how they would kind of create ideas back then. They'd have huge conferences. Einstein wasn't buying any of it. And I actually think he's more on the correct side of this than the others. And I mean, Schrodinger, I think, was on Einstein's side, even though he's associated with the wave function. In other words, there is a reality. I like the Hugh Everett interpretation. I'm not saying that's the way it really works, but I'm just saying as a way of thinking about it, because there's different ways of construing Everett's ideas. Just the idea, if you can just get this one idea into your mind, I think it's a big success for your day today, for me too, that all these possibilities are real. They are not figments of your imagination.
I
don't
agree.
Disappear when you're not looking at
so
them.
that's why I titled my show the show Everything Imaginable, because if it can be imagined, then it's real.
I actually believe that's physically true. Now, you may not be experiencing it, but just like me in my RV class back in '96, I didn't think that was going to be real. And, but it was. It turned out you can see things before you physically see them. And so that is what you conclude, is that everything in your imagination is a reality happening somewhere. I believe this, actually. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to experience it physically or anything like this, but it's real for somebody somewhere. And that's why imagination is so important and so powerful, right? For creativity.
It's everything. All the things that you and I are talking about, we wouldn't be talking about if people like Einstein and Bohr had imagined this stuff.
Right. They imagined all these possibilities, and we're still sorting through it. And it just takes a lot of guts to go beyond what the mainstream is doing. Even in any field, you're dealing with vested interests. People have put a lot of effort into their careers on a certain set of ideas. And we know this happens with organizations and governments, is they don't want to divert from what they've been doing, because then they'd have to admit they were wrong or they made a mistake. Nobody likes doing that, right? And this is what we're dealing with the UFO issue, with Bigfoot, cryptids, all of this stuff.
Yeah, they have to.
I don't even have names for these types of life forms that are out there. We don't have any idea, Gary. We have no idea what's out there. It's very easy to dismiss this because they're not common in the human experience every single day, but enough people experience these phenomena often together, UFOs and cryptids in the same area, that really have to make you wonder whether we're living in this sort of Everettian universe of parallel realities. And somehow these entities on the other side can choose when they come through to ours. We don't know necessarily how to get through to theirs, at least in our physical form. They seem to know how to show up. Some of the UFO, I'm not saying they're all from parallel realities. Maybe they're from here. Maybe they're civilizations here on Earth, or even visiting from other places in our galaxy. That's certainly probable. But that doesn't mean that some of it isn't also like an energy type form that's coming through from other parallel realities. And if you want a way to think about it, anyone listening, like, well, Simeon, how do you think about this? It's very simple. It's just like frequencies on a radio dial. You could tune to one station on your radio. It doesn't mean the other stations aren't there. You're just not listening to them. Just because you spent your whole life and tuned to one station. Like when I grew up in New York, there was 1010 winds, right? You could just leave that 1010 winds on all the time because they would do news, they would do weather. They had that little sound of, the typewriters going, the teletype, and you could just leave that station on. It doesn't mean there wasn't also 99X and all these other stations on other bands on FM, right?
Z100.
Z100. Yeah, so we all grew up with these radio stations, at least you and I did, but we knew that just because we're listening to one channel doesn't mean the other ones weren't going on at the same time. I think that's the easiest analogy for understanding parallel realities. And if anyone has a better explanation of how these phenomena just seem to pop up in people's homes, things that walk through walls, I'm open to other explanations. I just think the simplest, I like to take the Einsteinian point of view. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. If you want to make it complicated, fine. But I'm more of an Einsteinian here. I just like to simplify it without denying the data. I'm not saying simplify it by pretending it doesn't exist. I'm saying, assuming all these experiences people tell us they have are true on your show and others, the easiest explanation, the simplest, most direct, is parallel realities that have bleed through, that are not always parallel. If they're always parallel, they wouldn't interact. They occasionally cross, and they come into your life, and you don't have to be afraid of it. You don't have to run away in terror. It's just there's other things out there, and they may not look at all like what you're used to life looking at. As I write about in Dark Matter Monsters, they may be based on dark matter. They may absorb more relic neutrinos than you are, which is going to give them abilities that you and I don't have yet. And they may have supernatural types of strength. They may be able to do mind talk into your mind directly. They may be able to cloak, teleport, look like a tree, and then walk away. All of this stuff. It's all happening out there. We all know people who've experienced this.
Yes.
And we don't need to stigmatize these people. Let's just admit we're living in a multiverse and people have these experiences. And it may not make sense, just like remote viewing didn't make sense to me. I could see it was real, even though I still to this day am not quite sure how I'm doing it. I teach classes in it. People say they like it. I still don't know quite how they do what they're doing, but they're doing it.
Yeah.
And I think it's better to be on the side of wonder and surprise and learning than to just put everything in like a mental jail and just say, oh, those people are just weirdos who are having these experiences and there's something wrong with them. Stigmatize them, ridicule them, because it's just ordinary people who are having these experiences. And it's really society. I forgot who that psychologist was that I used to read as a high school student. Who was that guy? He always said it wasn't, he treated schizophrenic people. You might have read his books. I forgot. I was trying to think of his name. He made this argument, which appealed to me as a 15-year-old in high school, that it was society that was schizophrenic, and these were normal people in a schizophrenic society. You remember that sort of argument?
I do. Yeah.
In the 70s.
And I also adopted that theory because, like, when I had friends, like, new people that were schizophrenic, I'd wonder, like, maybe it's just like they don't have a filter that I have, and they're seeing something that's there. Maybe just the filter for them wasn't there. Just like when people take hallucinogens, maybe what they're seeing isn't a hallucination.
Yeah.
Maybe we're just pulling a filter away.
I think you have to ask this question. I think what you're saying is exactly the way I've been thinking more recently, is maybe these, and I think that name is almost coming back to me. What was this guy? He's kind of a radical psychiatrist. He had a degree in psychiatry. He's a radical psychiatrist. That was the idea, is they don't have the filters that we have. So maybe they're experiencing reality. Because I know I talked to a psychiatrist recently from Texas, and he wanted to talk to me because a lot of his clients had experienced Bigfoot, Dogman, and other cryptids over the course of their life somewhere in Texas. And he wanted to talk to me about it because he initially thought they must be delusional or schizophrenic. But when he gave them those batteries of psychological evaluating sorts of tests, that psychiatrists and psychologists use to sort of assess your mental state, they were completely normal, except they had experienced cryptids while hunting or hiking or as a kid or something. And he realized you know, that they don't people in those field of psychiatry, psychology aren't really trained how to deal with people who've had anomalous experiences, because it doesn't fit anywhere in their, you know, spectrum of disorders very easily. And so they don't really know what to do with it. And you know, they need some help to realize that these people believe they've had these experiences, and maybe if you and I were there, we would have seen what they've seen too. But there is no way to evaluate them based on how they've been taught. It's almost like all of these categories that we've been brought up with in society, in academics, are just archaic now. They're obsolete. We don't recognize it yet, and we know they're obsolete because we're having these special, you know, sub-organizations within the Pentagon look at UFOs now, because they don't even know what to call it. All domain anomaly resolution office. What the heck is that? All domain anomaly resolution office. That means you don't know what's going on. That's what it means. Just admit it. I think it'd be healthier if we admitted this. I think they should come out right now. Biden should come out right now.
Investigating things we don't understand. Like, what is wrong with that?
They're in the atmosphere. They're in the ocean. They show up. Weird stuff happens, and we don't know what they are.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, go home. It's better to do that than playing this game that we're playing right now. Like, you know, let's explain it away as, you know, flocks of geese and ice crystals and weather balloons. How long have we been listening?
Solar flares. That's always been my favorite.
Solar flares reflecting off the windshield. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's immature. And I'm still waiting for the day. Let me just give you an example of this, Gary. I was at the citizen hearing in 2013 in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club. It was a very respectable effort by Stephen Bassett and the Paradigm Research.
I know Stephen.
Right. And he held this thing called the citizen hearing. He wanted real senators and congresspeople to show up to be on the hearing panel, but he couldn't get anyone to show up. So he found retired congressmen and senators, Congress people and senators, congresswomen, who he paid to be on this hearing panel because he couldn't get any sitting representatives or senators to show up. And it was excellent testimony for 5 days, 40 witnesses, 8 hours a day. And there were extra stuff at night, which is also a lot of fun, lectures and so forth. Really, I still remember Gary Heseltine's lecture about all his cases and looking at it as a police detective. It was fascinating. Great bunch of folks there. Dr. Roger Lear was there. Gary, Marcel Jr., you know, the son of the Roswell witnesses and so forth. Any case, C-SPAN had cameras there. They could have turned on their C-SPAN cameras for 5 or 10 minutes, right? They didn't turn them on at all. And you had you had people, senior military people there. You had people who ran the FAA. You had nuclear, missile launch officers, 4 of them, saying that these objects had interfered with their missile control launch facilities, right? And all the other witnesses, Jesse Marcel Jr. and all the other ones who we know who've been involved in the field, and because some of these people had never come forward before, especially the missile control launch officers. I mean, they had been told by their superiors in the Air Force this never happened.
Yeah.
And David Schindele, who was a friend of Robert Salas, came forward because Salas, who had published some books on it, right? Robert Salas from the Maelstrom incident in 67, right? So he had talked to other control launch officers and said, you really need to come forward. This is more. So David Schindele was one of these people. He said he had never told this story that he told us to anybody before, because that's what he was told by his commanding officer that day. It never happened. And that's how we've been dealing with this multiverse. It's like that book Flatland from the 1880s. That sort of character, that sort of it was a caricature of British society in the Victorian England called Flatland, where everyone lives on a flat surface, and one day a sphere shows up, and it turns out at the end of the book, and they arrest the guy that says he saw a sphere and put him into an institution. But at the end of the book, it comes, you learn that the authorities that ran Flatland had known about Sphereland the whole time. And this is in the 1880s. This is not 1960. This is 18, that they had known about Sphereland the whole time, but they thought it would cause social chaos. So they didn't want anyone to know about it. But this is the situation we're in. We live in Sphereland, but we're pretending it's Flatland. I can't put it more simply than that. And then when your people and who are your superior officers in the military tell you it never happened, you will never talk about this, not even to your wife. I've talked to other people from the military who've had the same lecture when they had a UFO encounter.
Yeah.
There's a cover up going on. I don't know what anyone would put it. You could be like Steve Bassett, calling it a truth embargo, but it's a serious situation. You get people who've experienced something, and we should know about what it is. It has important consequences, but they're told to keep quiet.
Why do you think that? Do you think it's just because they don't want to admit that they don't know, or do you think it's that they do know and they're utilizing it for their own selfish benefit?
No, it's a good question, isn't it? I don't think we totally know the answer. There's one point of view that maybe private companies have this technology and they don't want to share it. It would cause us to ask questions of who has this technology. Is there a religious bias here that people who are more fundamentalists think it would threaten their interpretation of their religion, which is something that they can't really deal with? Or is it more the issue that governments never like to talk about things that they can't control? This was a discussion in this new David Paulides documentary 411 Missing the UFO Connection, where someone there says government, it was D'Souza, the former FBI agent, and Paulides asks him, because D'Souza is an honest FBI agent who's investigated paranormal phenomena and says his superiors and other departments within the FBI never wanted to talk about it, right? And we found this was also true with skinwalkers at the Pentagon. James Lukatsky, who says in that book, newer book, that when OSAP went to some of these intelligence agencies in DC, they said, we don't want to deal with this because it'll hurt our prospects for funding if we're associated with Skinwalker Ranch. Same, and this is what D'Souza is saying. They don't want to deal with anything that doesn't fit pretty well into some sort of bureaucratic label, right? That's how Washington, D.C. deals with things and bureaucracies in general. So the possibility is, maybe the most likely possibility is that governments just don't want to talk about things that they can't control or regulate or fund or something like that. It just doesn't. It's not on their reality screen because they can't do anything about it. And I've talked to people who know people higher up in our government who've had abduction experiences. They literally wake up outside their house, repeatedly. In some cases, the door is locked. They can't get back in. They're waking up outside their house. So, and they, John Alexander, retired military person, John, from the Army, he talked about this too at one of our conferences. He said he knew people within Department of Homeland Security who'd had these abduction experiences. And if we're to believe Lukatsky, people from the DIA that worked at Skinwalker Ranch went home and saw these werewolf dogman type creatures in their backyards. I mean, their whole family saw them. I think the implication is they hadn't talked about it because it was considered classified, but they still saw them, the other members of the family. So, and that created the idea of this hitchhiker effect, which I look at more as like a multidimensional frequency effect. You can call it what you want. I don't know if they're being followed home. I mean, we could debate that, but the reality is we learned from Lukatsky, and we've learned from this experience of other people that have worked in the government, that there's not a lot of openness to these subjects because people that work in bureaucracies are concerned with their their long-term benefits and retirement package and all this, and they don't want anything to threaten that. So unfortunately, they're not the most intellectually curious people in the world. So how do we deal with this as a society, given that people experience this and it affects them? People become afraid to go out at night who've experienced these cryptids, things like this. People who've had these UFO experiences. I mean, it's well, I guess let's sum it up this way. The longer we take to deal with this as a country, the more critical it will be when we finally do deal with it. There'll be more and more witnesses we didn't realize were there, and it could cause quite a change in how our society functions if we don't talk about it,
Right.
as adults.
Do you think too that maybe they're afraid that if we know that we are as individuals or as a collective, that we're an infinite stream of consciousness with no beginning, no end, that's omnipresent, and since that's the case, there's in reality there's nothing for us to be afraid of. There's nothing to stop us from doing what we want to do, and it gives us all this unlimited freedom by having that kind of knowledge. And one of the things I think that concerns them. I think they're concerned of what would happen if people start believing that kind of idea. That's a dangerous idea to them.
I think it is. I think all these organizations we're around really want some sort of continuity, and they don't want, their members going off in all these new directions. So it's a type of social control, even if it's not deliberate social control. It's still a type of, in sociology, we call these things hidden events. And hidden events are things that people experience, but they don't want to talk about for some reason. And it takes some sort of official, and child abuse is a good example of that, because this was a thing that people didn't believe in until the 60s. It wasn't considered a real diagnosis. The more common explanations that were given were that some kids had fragile bones, they were just breaking on their own, these kind of intellectual alibis. Anything not to deal with the reality of what was going on. Doctors did not want to accuse parents of hurting their kids. And so all these professionals had this interest not to diagnose child abuse. And it took some individuals to bring all these professionals together in the same room in a couple of meetings in the 60s to agree that it was really happening. Excuse me. To look at the radiograph charts, and the x-rays, and to bring law enforcement in and to kind of look at the evidence and come to some determination of what was going on. And they finally realized these kids were not falling out of trees. They were being abused by their parents or somebody else. And that was a big step for society to take in the 50s. It's just part of our evolution. And that's what people forget, is we've always been evolving as a society. It wasn't that long ago that women couldn't even vote. So, and African Americans, right? And it's been this long process of extending this equality to everybody. But to me, that also includes people who've had these types of experiences too. And I think that's what it's going to come to eventually, because this seems to be the general trend of our Western society, is to create more and more equality. And I think that means everybody.
One of the interesting things too, I think, is more and more people are becoming open to what we're talking about right now. And when you become more open to something, then you're going to be more likely to perceive it, to see it, to experience it. Like paranormal investigators who are open-minded are the ones that are more likely to have experiences. So people who are more open to the idea of UFOs are the ones who are going to see that. And but then there's a point too where I think like you reach like a critical mass of people who believe versus the ones that don't, and then reality starts to shift.
Right. And I think it's shifting right now. I think it's really shifting right now. And again, this has happened before in history. It wasn't that long ago that we just believed everything revolved around the Earth, that this was the main planet of the entire universe. It was just us and Jupiter and a couple other planets that you could see with the naked eye. That was it. Everything went around the Earth, including the sun. until people, a couple natural philosophers pointed out that's not the simplest way to look at it. It doesn't make sense really to look at it that way. It's too complex. That model worked, that Ptolemaic model of the Earth being the center of the universe. You could make it mathematically work. It would predict the motions of Mars and Jupiter and the other planets that were Venus, right? You had to have all these little things called epicycles in there, these other rotations, and these things called equants and deference. And I learned about this from James Wooden's book, The Discovery of Science, which is a great book about how just the whole idea of science had to be invented. People actually had to want to look at an alternative explanation to Aristotle. Aristotle ruled for like over 1,000 years his way of thinking. And it was this what people said, just do what Aristotle did. You don't have to question. It doesn't matter if you see anything different. It's not what Aristotle said, or the church. And if they didn't say it, it doesn't exist. It doesn't matter. The experience didn't matter. And it took a while. What Wooden says, it took a while before evidence actually mattered, which is why things like the microscope, Llewellyn Hooke invents this microscope in like the 1600s, and no one looks through it for 150 years because they just figure, well, why? We already know what's going on. It's just four humors, when bloodletting, all that was the main treatment, and it was just this imbalance of the four fluids in your body. We don't need new evidence. So we actually have to want to, we're going through the same thing right now. We actually have to want to look at the evidence. And so I think, it does, these changes do happen every so often, where you have people come along and they propose another way of looking at things. And that means also a willingness to look at the evidence. And then to come to a conclusion. And I think we're in one of those time periods right now where we wouldn't have this conversation. Because society went through this in the past. I mean, the heliocentric idea was really resisted. Galileo was put under house arrest. Copernicus didn't even want to publish this while he was alive. Can you imagine us saying, okay, let's have this conversation, Simeon, but we're not going to air it till we're both passed on because we're afraid of the content. That's what it was like. And we don't have to, we know it's changed because we can have this conversation right now without fear of the secret police.
Well, even that's happened with UFOs, where there's been like deathbed confessions about, UFOs and things the government did.
Yeah. This is what it's been. I've talked to people like this. I've talked to people that don't even want to go public. I've talked to people that have had proof positive evidence of some materials, technologies, craft that have been here, that they tell me cannot be made on Earth. The materials are not what we have here, the zero-G environment. The density of electronic structures in there are far too dense for what we can do with our equipment. And they tell me they're 100% certain it's from another part of the galaxy. 100%, no doubt. And these are the people that would know. These are really high-level engineers and so forth. They've never come public. And I couldn't get them to do interviews publicly. They would tell me, like at a conference over a buffet dinner, the most amazing stuff. I mean, we're not talking about philosophy here. We're talking about people from Silicon Valley, okay, who've seen this stuff. The government comes to them and says, can you tell us how this works? Every 10 years, apparently, the government digs all this Roswell wreckage out of the basement. And they bring it around, they shop it around to see maybe science is caught up and we can, exploit this technology. If it wasn't already, I don't know if Corso is correct, maybe we already got some technologies out of the Roswell wreckage, but there's more than Roswell. Anyway, so there are people out there that know this. So Gary, what I think it is like you're saying, do we need to wait for people to be on their deathbeds to talk about what's happened? Or can we talk about it now? Because the witnesses are out there, and this is what the citizen hearing demonstrated in Steve Bassett. As Steve said, for every witness here at the citizen hearing, there were 40. He goes, there's 100 behind them and 100 behind those, and more. Keeps going. There's just so many witnesses out there. This is just 40 out of 1,000. But will C-SPAN turn the cameras on so that the American public can hear it, or we're just going to pretend like it's? You can't continue that way forever. I worked in Vienna, Austria during the Cold War, right at the end. At an East-West Institute that was set up by Nixon and Brezhnev, okay? And it was set up so that Soviet Union and U.S. could agree on something to work together. It's not a bad idea, climate change, something that was neutral, that didn't involve military conflict. It's a good idea. We could get our scientists together and we could work together. And it was a lot of fun working with Soviet mathematicians, my age in the 20s, when I was in my 20s. And it was a long time ago. But that's the year that East Germany ceased to exist.
Oh,
I mean,
on
and
the wall.
the wall came down, but it
Mhm.
started right there in Vienna when the Hungarian government just all of a sudden on their own, this is how easy it can be. It's not hard. The Hungarians said, okay, we're sick of this wall. They were part of the Iron Curtain, Hungary. So they said, we're just not enforcing the border anymore. What are you going to do? So they I went up to the border. They cut the barbed wire. The guard posts were empty. It went down through some lake right there, not far from Vienna to the south. The border between Hungary and Austria. Previously, there was a fence in the middle, or like a guard post. There were guard posts in the middle of the lake.
Wow.
And they were on. So the East Germans come over on vacation to Vienna and say, well, we're not going home. We're staying. We like it better in the West. We're not going back. And more and more East Germans started going to Hungary, which was part of the East Bloc, so they could have permission to travel there, but they just never went home. They just went right across into Austria on the train. And all of a sudden, that caused people in East Germany to wonder, well, what's this wall doing here if people are just leaving? And it disappeared that night in December of '89, not from a true story. There was a rumor put up by it was a news report from an Italian news station that the guards were letting people through the wall that night, the East German guards. And it wasn't true, but so many people showed up. Remember this? So many people showed up at the wall that the guards said, what do we do? And their higher ups, and there were like hundreds of thousands of people at the wall wanting to go through. They just said, we'll let them through. And that was the end of East Germany. That was the end of it. But it started with a country on the periphery opening up the gates. So I can imagine this UFO. A lot of these topics, I mean, I think will all come out at the same time. There's a lot of material here, but I think a lot of material for us to digest as a society. But I think it'll come sooner than you think, just the way that East Germany, nobody expected that to happen in '89. I certainly didn't go over there.
No, I didn't expect it.
Nobody expected it, and I didn't think those would be the last East Germans I ever spoke to in my life, because their country merged with West Germany, and it's over a period of a couple of years, and they ceased to exist as a country, and then the Soviet Union ceased to exist. It was a domino effect, a reverse domino effect.
Yeah,
back in towards the middle of the empire. And so I think these changes can happen faster than people expect. And that means, you could be encountering things sooner than you think. You could be encountering things.
I know we're running out of time. I have one last question for you.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
If this happens, when we find out, what would be the benefit?
Well, I think it's just at a basic human level, we deserve the right to know what sort of universe, multiverse we live in. I think at just a spiritual level, it'll give us a sense of ease, because of the types of experiences that people have every day, they don't know how to process. But at a global level, I mean, I think maybe people like Reagan were right, is that if we find out that there's other entities out there, humanoids, it would make us realize we have a lot more in common with each other, more in common than different.
Wouldn't that be fantastic?
Peace might break out.
We could use that.
How about that? Peace might break out. And then there's obviously technological implications, because we're all living right now on an economy and a technological system that's based on carbon extraction. Creates pollution, it's expensive, and it's limited. So obviously in the long term, the idea would be to have technologies that allow us to live in a way that's more harmonious with the planet. It's not so destructive, so that we're not just using up all these resources and creating pollution and conditions that wipe out other species. I don't think anyone agrees that that's a good idea, to wipe out the other denizens of the planet, some of whom we don't even know very well,
right,
that are going extinct before we've even met them. for the most part. That's kind of sad. And they've been here a long time. And so, we're creating these environmental catastrophes on the planet that could be avoided perhaps if we weren't using carbon-based fuels, if we had resources, energy right from nature the way it is, cold fusion, low energy nuclear reaction, LENR as it's called. I think those are, based on all my research, those are absolutely real technologies. Maybe they're not quite ready to go today as an energy source, and maybe we're not ready for that either. But
you think like dark matter and dark energy could provide us energy that's free from?
They do. And I know this for a fact because there was a Ukrainian LENR cold fusion company called Proton 21 Thermodynamics that was bought by the US Department of Energy, and it's relocated to Oak Ridge National Labs. If you don't think this cold fusion LENR is real, why is the Department of Energy buying up a foreign company, all 100 of its scientists and employees, and moving it to the US? It's pretty good indication. And what Proton 21 said in their literature before their website was taken down, you can still find it on the Wayback Machine. Their website literally was taken down from the web, Proton 21. Very smart bunch of guys, scientist Adamenko, Vysotsky, very smart people. Right there, Gary, right in their first either interviews, they talk about dark matter interacting with our matter, dark matter propelling cold fusion LENR reactions, dark matter objects and energy structures that would absorb a bullet. I can see why the government wanted to absorb them, because they talked about creating materials that were a whole different type of materials. I mean, really use your imagination here. Materials that are based on dark matter. It's literally what they said. We're not talking science fiction here. This was a top level energy company that realized, and other scientists have Matsumoto in Japan and Parkhomov in Russia have said the same thing, is that we're interacting with this neutrinoverse. Boyd Bushman from Lockheed Martin talked about the neutrinoverse interacting with gravity. So we know at this level, if we can control these interactions with neutrinos, which are super abundant in the universe and come from the cosmos all the time and are bosonic, which means they encourage physical reactions to happen. Versus moving apart fermionic, more like electrons. There's energy possibilities there that really get us over the hump in terms of getting self-organizing sustainable energy sources that could supply our energy needs using neutrinos, using dark matter. We now know that low energy nuclear reaction, based on all my research, is something that is catalyzed by dark matter. Not all of dark matter. We're talking about just a tiny part of it. There's so much dark matter, you only need the relic neutrinos. It's enough to catalyze these reactions. And, you get beyond these thermodynamic limits, the second law entropy, which the people will always argue, well, this is like a perpetual motion machine. It's impossible. Not if you include the energy you're getting from relic neutrinos. Relic neutrinos contribute a lot of energy to biological and physical chemical processes on Earth. And Alexander Parkhomov in his book Space, Earth, Human, which I read a lot of before I published Dark Matter Monsters. He argues that you can show variations, and this is really mind-blowing. You can show variations in chemical, biological, even radioactive decay processes, which are supposed to be constant. I mean, they're random, but the distribution is constant of the decay rates. It changes based on exposure to where we are in the cosmos, the positions of other galaxies. Because dark matter, you talked about gravity earlier. It flows and fluxes around other galaxies. And there's even this idea in remote viewing, which we talked about right at the beginning of the show, sidereal time, local sidereal, that our position relative to the Virgo constellation affects remote viewing accuracy. And I've seen the charts of this from people that ran SRI, the remote viewing research program in Palo Alto, SRI, which was a government special access program for a while. And Ed argued to us that he could see the variation, and it's apparently by a factor of 4 in remote viewing accuracy, depending on whether the Earth is facing that Virgo cluster or facing away, which is very consistent with the idea that there's these flows of cosmic particles, and where, you know, if we're facing away from it, the Earth is shielding you, right? If you're facing towards it, it's bosonic, it's increasing the interactions. It's really interesting stuff. It deserves a lot more research, but it's very interesting that companies like Proton 21, which have now gone dark because they were so good at what they were doing, we're talking about this openly, about creating dark matter structures. Also, Ken Shoulders, who worked at SRI, a guy that invented microelectronic masking techniques for circuit boards and things for the NSA, by the way, way back in the 60s. His whole research towards the end of life was these exotic vacuum objects, charge clusters, dark matter, how this all works, like a fifth state of matter. And that's where we're at right now, is are there other states of matter beyond these ordinary states of matter that we're used to, that interact more with dark matter, that are coherent, invisible some of the times, create orbs, ball lightning, other life forms may be using this, UFOs, so forth. So I think there's a lot of really exciting science on the horizon, you know, as long as we are willing to be open to it. And this gets back to the argument again. Are we willing to engage with this evidence and this reality? Or do we just want to stay like ostriches with our head in the sand, pretending everything is the way we were taught when we were in kindergarten? I'm willing to go the new direction. Sure, we don't know where it's going to lead us, but isn't that a lot more exciting and fun every day to wake up with all these possibilities than with the same old, same old? Because we know that same old is getting older every day at this point, right?
I've always believed in all this ever since I was a kid. I just thought that this was like, I was a kid, like how I got interested. I was a kid. I watched the show with Leonard Nimoy, In Search Of.
Yeah, right.
And after that, I was just hooked. I was like, God, there's all this stuff that I probably don't know.
Right.
You know, and I always had that in my head since I was a kid.
Yeah, I grew up with Star Trek. I remember watching Star Trek on our black and white TV before we had a color TV. And that was the same thing. It was just really like, wow. You know, each of those episodes were like really inspiring for a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
Right. So it turns out that's reality. That Star Trek is closer to reality than we thought. And a lot of the concepts in there seemed ahead of their time. And now, you know, we're being told you could create teleporters like that. I mean, eventually. So far, only molecules have been teleported. But, you know, I don't know if we'd want teleporters exactly like that. But those sort of ideas are actually based somehow in reality. And again, it gets back to your idea that imagination is, we're really seeing other realities when we use our imagination. But I say it's high time that we all go into this reality. We push our representatives in Washington to ask the hard questions, to find out I think here's how this has to start. We have to know what's been going on the past 70 years, Roswell and before. Don't you think? What is the story here?
Absolutely. Like that last disclosure thing, you know, I was hoping that you would, you know, say like, yeah, Roswell was real. We have the craft.
But, at that hearing.
Yeah, but that's not.
You're talking about that hearing in May?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, there you are in front of Congress. What are they waiting for? And now they're just trying to rewrite history, call them UAPs. They don't mention anything before 2000. You know, it's such a limited number of sightings. Exactly. So they have this hearing in Washington. We all watched it, right? You think this is going to be it. They're going to say we have the Roswell craft at Wright-Patterson, or the bodies, or the creatures, or whatever. And I met a witness who said her dad flew some of the stuff from Roswell to Wright-Patterson.
I worked at Bell Labs, and one of the scientists there, he was the older guy at the time. This is like in the 90s. It was like 99. Yeah, it was 99. And he was outside smoking a pipe. And I smoked cigarettes back then. And he was telling me that the idea for fiber optics came from reverse engineering a UFO.
At Roswell?
Yeah.
Wow. So he confirmed what Corso said in the day after Roswell.
Yes. Because this is before I have you heard of Corso. This is the 99.
Before Corso published his book, this guy said Bell Labs got it from UFOs.
Yes.
because that was always the counter argument, Gary,
And
is
he was
that
very
Bell Labs
nonchalant
invented
about it too. Like
stuff.
he
Yeah.
didn't care about telling people.
And he told you that.
Yeah, I mean, the guy had to be like 80.
You know, I've encountered people like this, and I encountered one of these witnesses who said her dad on his deathbed. You're talking about deathbed confessions. On his death, 2 weeks before he dies, he calls each daughter one at a time into the room. Said, I didn't want to tell you, but I was the guy that flew. I was one of the planes that flew wreckage back, since there was a lot of it. And there were guards in the plane. There was a guard in the plane to guard the contents from the pilots who were,
Wow.
nuclear qualified pilots held over from World War II,
Hmm.
who were qualified to drop atomic bombs. These are the types of pilots you had. It was the only nuclear base at the time. So these were the pilots you had at Roswell, the ones that could drop nukes, as happened to Japan at the end of World War II, right?
Yeah.
And she told me that he said, I was afraid there'd be repercussions against the family if I talked about it, but there were crates of stuff and I never got to see it. There was a guard guarding it and he never left the crates. And we flew this circuitous route. First, we went to Texas, and then we eventually ended up at Wright-Patterson. And he didn't know what was in the boxes, but he said it had to be important to have a guard guarding it. No, it's not polyethylene balloons, right? So yeah, it's really high time to examine all this. What's our history here? And all these people like you met, these scientists, why don't we get them all together in the same room in front of Congress and have a hearing, right? Under oath, and subpoena them so they have to tell the truth, right? And don't have to, hide behind these security oaths that they probably took at some point, right? I think this is what has to happen. It has to open up. We could all breathe easier after this. Let's hear what the reality is. Because until we know our own history about this, I just don't feel any of this current effort that we hear about, just like we were talking about this hearing last May, where they say, well, we'll talk about that in closed session this afternoon. The USOs. Someone just mentions the USOs, underwater submerged objects. You've heard about them. You've talked to people in subservice in the Navy. They talk about these things. And yet that question immediately says, okay, I don't want to talk about it. Well, I think we have a right to hear about this. What sort of, and again, it goes back to this whole discussion we've had this afternoon. Do we want to know what reality we live in? Or do we want to play this game, this sort of childish version of reality where we don't want to admit any of this has happened? Because I think that's really dull. It's like that movie Pleasantville, where it starts out in black and white. I really don't want to go back in black and white, having grown up. That's where we're going if we don't insist. And there's some good representatives out there who are calling, even in the press, even on some of the media channels. This is what it's going to take. And I mean, what's the worst that could happen? I mean, it's our own history, What are they hiding at this point? I can't figure it out. The only argument I've heard, Gary, from people who are, who think of it in military terms is it might give our adversary some technological advantage.
One of my other theories is telepathy. I think we all have the ability to use telepathy if we practice it, like any other muscle. And if we're able to use telepathy, then that makes it a lot more difficult for people to hide their thoughts and their intentions to control other people.
Right. Maybe that's it. Yeah.
I mean, it's a simple one.
Could be. I'm with you on that one. One of the stories I mentioned in Dark Matter Monsters is this former Pentagon official who was, even put in charge of the Pentagon as Secretary of Defense for a number of weeks before the official person could be sworn in. And he told me that he just told me this at an RV conference where I met him and his wife. He said he was in an intelligence group that monitored a Soviet PK experiment where a Soviet PK sender bent a spoon 1,000 miles away in Moscow. And I said, isn't that like a news story or something? He goes, no, we can't talk about it. Sources and methods, And he said, it's really serious that we don't reveal how we pick this up from other countries. I get that. the surveillance methods. No
Right.
country wants to reveal this to another, but still, that is, the US government knows for a fact that PK is real, that some people can bend objects at a
That's why
distance with
SRI
their
existed. I mean, even Yuri Geller was part of it.
Yuri Geller. Yuri Geller.
I've been trying to get him on, actually.
You should. He should come on your show.
He doesn't want to do. He doesn't want to do shows, I don't think, anymore.
Oh, we should get him on your show here. Yuri Geller was the first experiment there. Before Ingo Swann, they had Yuri Geller come over. And in that movie, Third Eye Spies, about remote viewing, which is a great RV movie that everyone should see, that the best one to date. They show all of his results, especially
it's incredible.
Yeah, you get the bonuses at the end if you buy it. And you get those extra bonuses at the end, and it's worth it because you see that documentary that SRI produced of his results. You saw it. It's incredible. Yeah. It's 10 out of 10 hits on those objects that they put in a box, and he was able to bend things and do other things at other times. Even Kit Green said that Yuri Geller just did some amazing things. Well, they had Yuri Geller at SRI, and they call up Kit Green, who's at the the spook desk at CIA. That's the guy there who would be open to this stuff. And he just says, okay, describe what's in my office. And Yuri says, I'm getting something like scrambled eggs. It's like architecture of the brain. And that's what Kit was looking at right at the time. He saw that. It was said architecture of the brain.
Right.
And Kit said he almost fell out of his floor. I mean, he's off his chair. He's looking around. Is there cameras? I mean, that's how startling it could be, someone like Yuri. But how did Yuri start in all of this? Yuri tells us he was followed by a ball of light in the courtyard of his apartment complex, something like that.
That's interesting. And that's one of the things, too, that you talk about in your title was ball lightning.
Yeah.
Which one time, this is a weird story. I was at my brother's house at a family function, sitting on the couch with a bunch of family members. I'm sitting next to my grandmother. This ball of lightning comes through the door, around the corner, it goes, and then out another door. But the only two people who saw it were me and my grandmother. Nobody else that was sitting there saw it.
Nobody else saw it. They could, it would have been visible to them, but they didn't see it.
Absolutely, it should have been visible to them. There's no way to miss it.
It's just like cryptids. Is sometimes people will see them on a trail and the other people from another angle won't. Well, that's how I connected too. Is there's a lot of similarities between ball lightning and cryptids to some extent. And yeah, ball lightning is a very interesting. It's coherent matter where the particles are all at the same frequency and they don't have any individual identity. They just form one big electron or what other particle it's made of. And there's a lot of energy in ball lightning, and it does weird things. It seems to move around. It's what?
It steered his way around and out the other door.
It seems to know now the scientific explanation of why ball lightning seems to move so precisely. It even follows people. Is that it's following static gradients. It's so sensitive. It's such a finely tuned thing that it's very sensitive to electrostatic gradients, which is why it's seen going down the aisle of a plane sometimes, right between the seats. It's sort of following this gradient, and nobody totally knows. I mean, the hard-boiled scientists would say it's just very sensitive to electrostatic charges. It's following them. But when you see it move around like you did, it seems like it knows what it's doing.
Yeah, like what if it's consciousness?
It might be. You can't rule it out. It just, we know the studies of ball lightning going back hundreds of years have all commented on this, how precisely it seems to move around a room. And occasionally it can explode, as you know. And but other times it seems innocuous. It's a range of characteristics, but that is what coherent matter is. It's a type of matter where all the particles are correlated. It's like a macroscopic quantum object, and all the particles are intercorrelated, and it has a fractal signature. When all the particles are correlated like that, it's what Parkhomov calls flicker noise. In other words, it doesn't react to things in a linear way like we're used to with our technology. A small change could cause a big effect in ball lightning. It's almost impossible to predict what it's going to do. And it's seen around these cryptids. It's seen around UFOs. So it's definitely part and parcel of these phenomena in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing too, you mentioned the guys at the missile base, who, they test, say that the nuclear stuff was turned off. I wonder sometimes too if we fired nukes in our dimension, does it ripple effect into other dimensions and affect them? And that's why some of them other beings in the dark matter dimensions might be concerned.
I think so. I think it's a really good possibility that it's affecting them. It's affecting the structure of space-time. And wherever they are in space-time, it's affecting them in some way.
Yeah, like, gosh, stop creating potholes on our side.
Yeah, it's creating space-time potholes. It must be the reason why they're so interested in our nukes. And I don't think it's, as some people think, to save us. I don't think they're going to step in and save us, but maybe for their own self-preservation, they just figure, okay, we're taking the matches away from the humans because they're going to burn the house down.
Yeah.
And they don't realize we're in the house too. So we're just,
if they're sitting on top of us or underneath us, we're a problem.
Yeah, I think that just that. Okay, so that topic alone is so huge of UFOs and nukes. It's such a complex, interesting topic that we haven't touched because of national security reasons, because no government anywhere is going to admit that their nukes aren't going to fire right properly if there's been tampering or even unintentional effects on these weapon systems from the proximity of the UFOs. I mean, it's a really complex, important issue. And the missile control launch officers that I've talked to, the ones who are guards, I did an interview with a guy named Gary Sterling from the Aurora, Denver area. And he was a guard at Minot in the 70s. And he told me that he was sent out with his buddy in the truck, their Jeep, to see what was setting the alarms off several times in the same day. And they encountered a huge object shooting straight up from the silo that was blinding. And he got burned. They all got burned on the right side of their bodies. And then the Air Force attempted to hypnotize them. And you're thinking, are there hypnotists at an Air Force base? Well, I happened to run into someone who, a psychologist, who told me he was offered the job in the 70s as a hypnotist at Minot and turned it down. So it confirmed what Gary had told me. So Gary said he wasn't a very good hypnosis subject, but they did tell him, if you know what's good for you, you won't talk about this to the press or anyone else. So just like Terry Lovelace in his book, Incident Devils. And yeah, have you had Terry on the show?
A couple of times.
So it's just like Terry's story.
And I've talked to Terry off the air too, where he has some even more interesting things to say.
Yeah, Terry, his story, the same thing. Brad, the psychologist, tries to hypnotize him, and Terry resists it internally. He says, you're going to forget about all this. And Terry remembers it all one day. It all comes back to him during a routine x-ray when they find embedded metal samples in his body. And it's a very interesting story, Terry, but it's the same, you just from reading his book, Incident Devil's Den, everyone should read that. Yeah, because it's just a very straightforward account of how you're going to be treated by the military if you've had an experience like this. And they're basically going to tell you it never happened. And not only that, you're never going to talk to the other guy who you're with that it happened to. They separate him. And in Terry's case, it's very sad that his buddy Toby ended up passing away apparently from alcoholism. Yeah. After the event. No, this is very serious stuff. We need to know what's going on with this, and I think we'd all feel a lot better.
So what do you think about Luis Alejandro? Do you think that he's really out there trying to bring out the truth, or do you think he's disinformation?
Luis has a lot to say about these topics. There's some discrepancy which we still haven't resolved. I appreciate what Elizondo and Mellon have done since they've come forward at the same time, right? And they've brought a lot of this to our attention. But I just feel, and they would probably agree, they're also just one of many people who've been involved in this field who've played a role in bringing it to our attention, and we have to keep moving forward from
Right.
it. It's not about the particular individual
Mm-hmm.
personalities. I think my question is, based on what I read in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, was there an ATIP program at all? Or, I mean, Luis Elizondo said that he was in charge of this ATIP program. We're told that ATIP was a nickname for OSAP. And even Hal Puthoff said the same thing at his 2018 presentation in Vegas, that ATIP was an unclassified name that could be mentioned in public for OSAP, which it wasn't classified, but they didn't want it to become public. So they called it ATIP. So was Elizondo involved in that program? I just have some questions that still haven't been resolved in my mind about what was there an ATIP program? Was it a different program that he called ATIP? So I have some questions about some of the things he's said, but I also feel like it does seem like he's pushed pretty hard to get people in Congress to pay attention to this. That's my understanding based on everything I've heard him say. Yes.
He's done that.
Yeah, I think it's moving forward because he and Mellon have been pushing hard. I mean, if you have someone like Christopher Mellon, who's a former DOD high-level official, right? Third down at the Pentagon, he's telling us day in and day out, this is serious. This matters. We need to pay attention to this. We have to get past this bureaucratic intransigency and resistance. And we need to know what's going on because it's affecting pilots up there. I believe him. And, I'm sure there's other people like Mellon that we haven't heard from. But I mean, if you have people like that who quit over this, it tells us how serious this subject really is. And I have a feeling it's extremely serious, just from the types of incidents I've heard about. Just like I mentioned, the PK event in the Soviet Union, that 30 people, I'm told, were present in a room when they heard the spoon bend. I mean, they heard the experimenters and they knew that the spoon had bent. But how much else has happened around us that's been classified? Crash retrievals, right?
Yeah.
Could have happened. The witnesses are definitely silenced in one way or another. I mean, it's that serious. And this affects communities where this happens, where people aren't told what was really going on. Look at that new movie from James Fox, Moment of Contact, about the Varginha incident in 1996. I heard Roger Lear talk about this many times, but it's really amazing. In this movie, there's witnesses that Lear never met from the military who still won't talk. They have one right there, and they go right up to his house in Brazil, and he just talks to the window, says, "Get out of here. I'm going to start shooting at you guys." And he was a witness to one of these creatures that they were able to grab and bring into a vehicle before they took it to the hospital. And the person that grabbed it ended up dying of an infection over a period of a couple of weeks after that. So it ended up killing him, physically touching this. But there was another person in the vehicle, and this person wouldn't say anything to this day. So that shows us how serious this is. What about that case? I'm perfectly open to these new cases that pilots are experiencing, Navy pilots, maybe Air Force pilots. But what about these big cases where it affected entire communities? And to this day, the people feel like they're afraid of talking. That's pretty serious. It has a chilling effect.
Yeah.
And again, to go back to your question from about half an hour ago, why does it matter? I think if we have a better grasp on reality, we'll be more satisfied, happier people that are better able to take care of the planet and not live in such a destructive way. I just think it's the natural order of things to understand what's around you and to work with it in a productive, positive way. You can't do that if you don't know what you're dealing with, because then there's just fear. And as soon as one of these things shows up, people panic and they just go crazy. And if we just accepted there's other types of humanoids around, just for starters, I think this gets into the whole cryptids area. I mean, there is no public discussion about this, and yet people encounter Bigfoot, dogman like creatures all the time in North America, and they don't know where to go to talk about it. They're always told they saw a bear. The law enforcement doesn't know how to deal with it because they don't know if they're dealing with a person or not, if it's even in their jurisdiction. And it's like in this gray zone. And then people get terrified. They don't want to go back in the woods. They don't want to be out alone in areas where there's, just a lot of nature. And I don't think that has to be happening. I just think if we had a more realistic discussion of what's out there, and that you can encounter these creatures anytime you go out your door, pretty much. And we kind of accept it and deal with it, just like, there's raccoons out there and all sorts of things you could encounter when you go out to take your garbage. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but I don't think the way we deal with it is very productive to just deny that. And what about all these National Park Service rangers, which we are told have encountered these creatures out there, or whatever they are? Maybe some of them are human hybrids or something that we don't even have quite the words to describe. And the missing people that go missing out there. I mean, I think we should know what's actually happening out there, because then people just encounter this, they don't know what they're dealing with, and it's traumatic, and they feel traumatized. They don't want to go out at night anymore. They don't want to go camping anymore, or even take a walk. And so I think the responsible way to deal with this is just to have a national discussion about it. I've seen the documents from National Forest Service, people who've worked there, the photos of these Bigfoot reporting forms. I mean, the National Forest Services know about this, and so does the National Park Service. They must. And it's just like the UFO thing for me. Let's pretend it doesn't exist. It's rare enough that we don't have to deal with it. So let's kick the can down the road and let another administration deal with this, right? It's extra work. I'm told, I've read stories where it seems that they've even encountered bodies and things, and they've just preferred just to bury them right there on the spot, rather than report it to their superiors in the Park Service. And so that means we don't really have a good grasp of our own history. How are we related to these cryptids? It's a really another big story. Are these some sort of hybrids? Are we the hybrids? Are we the hybrids of them? Maybe they're the natural life forms and we're the hybrids, and they feel like their place and we're the weirdos. I don't know.
Well, that's one of the curiosities too that I have is, why are humans bipedal when all the other animals that have evolved on this planet run on 4 legs? Humans run on 2, which is not the optimal way to be on a planet with this much gravity.
Right.
It doesn't make sense.
The naked ape. Well, I guess we were told some point we stood up, but we don't know how that happened. And we know that Bigfoot stood up, and so did Dogman and other cryptids like them. What we have in common with these cryptid animals, cryptid creatures, or life forms, whatever they turn out to be, is that they're bipedal also. So that's the weird thing about it, and I think why we're reluctant to talk about it. We got used to being the only bipedal creature,
which is weird to begin with. We shouldn't be,
right? And it's very
hard. We don't want to look at that part of it.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how that happened. It's a good question. But how did these other creatures also ended up being bipedal, and what's our relationship to them? There's some big gaps here in our knowledge, and I don't know. It's just my bias. I would rather know than not know. Don't you think? I'd rather know what the heck's going on here.
I do too. That's why
I'm not afraid to go out and hike. And yeah, you too. I'm not afraid to go out there. And I've hiked a lot, backpack by myself. I mean, I'm willing to encounter anything out there. I'm not afraid of anything out there, but I'm open. I'm respectful out there. I'm careful, and now I have to admit, I'm looking around a lot more than I used to. I'm looking around because I've heard too many witnesses tell me, including a nurse that treated a lot of loggers, old timers from the backwoods in the Northwest, that they would see these Bigfoot creatures peek their heads out around a trunk, go back, and when they went to look for them, there wasn't anything behind the tree. They disappeared.
Right. I have a guest, Carter Bushart. And his theory is that they somehow merged with the tree.
That seems to be what happens. Now, why? I don't know exactly the physics behind that, but I'm sure it has something to do with fractals. I'm sure it's going to go back to fractals and frequencies. They do seem to merge with the tree. I know. To an ordinary hard-boiled scientist, that would seem like heretical. It would just seem like crazy, but that's what the witnesses say they see.
Well, it makes sense too. Camouflage is one of nature's, oldest tricks.
Yeah, and there's a name for it in science called dynamic transparency. They're animals that are good at
So why wouldn't nature start manipulating physics to do this?
Right. It just seems logical. It seems logical, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We just can't accept that we don't do it, or we don't know how to do it, and someone else can do it. And they can do it and we can't, because I've heard enough reports of these creatures morphing and looking like a pile of logs, boulders, and tree stumps, which are not like, they're not super convincing tree stumps, but they're enough if you walked by and weren't really paying attention, you'd keep going. How do they do that? And how do they just disappear in a moment? Have you ever had Ron Moorhead on the show?
A couple of times, yes.
Yeah, so Ron, so he always says these Bigfoot should have cast shadows from the angle which they heard them talking outside their wood structure. They should have cast shadows. There were cracks in the boards of their hunting structure. They could see sunlight. There should have been something like, you and I stand there, we're going to cast a shadow. They can hear them. You can hear the recordings.
I know. I've heard them.
Very close. There's nothing visible, but you can hear them chattering. So what we've got are cloaking bipeds.
Yeah.
Morphing cloaking bipeds that, when they're visible, look really hairy and tall and somewhat primate-like. And when they don't want to be seen, they can be like this. You won't see them. They'll be like Predator in the Predator movies, maybe a shimmer of something, but light's going to go through it. Light goes through other things. You worked at Bell Labs. There's metamaterials. There's all sorts of naturally occurring metamaterials in the Morphos butterfly that looks blue, but it's not from blue dye. It's from light refraction. And so nature has a way of being incredibly inventive. I'm sure it did this with Sasquatch too. Why we're not like that and how we're related, that's the big story. And that's why I think we don't know about this. I don't think you're going to get people in these institutions that feel like they're at the top of their game. They don't want to be humbled by something that they don't have any clue what it is. It's ego. And I can tell you, as someone who came out of academics, this is what it is. You got your degree, you have your publications, all that stuff. You get your awards occasionally, you win prizes, and you start building this professional ego. And
it depends on it. Your financing depends on it. Your
financing depends on it.
Your
mortgage, your
tenure,
kids'
all that shit.
All of it. It's a lifetime plan. Like that song by the Little River Band, right? I'm talking about a lifetime plan. Hurry, don't be late. I can hardly wait. Yeah, that little River Band song from Australia, right? So I'm talking about a lifetime plan. This is what happens to professionals. And I'm not trying to be mean to anyone who's a professional out there. I got a PhD too. But it can hinder your ability to talk the truth, to engage the truth, and eventually you become blinded by your own hubris, by your own success in these institutions, which are just these self-perpetuating things which will one day disappear too. And so you're playing the game and you've got the grants and you're on the gravy train. You don't really want anything to upset that. And eventually, I think, to be honest, you'll have to admit you're not willing to engage risky topics anymore because it could damage your funding prospects in the future. You'll know this is someone who worked at Bell Labs. This is going to hurt your funding prospects who's going to work with you. Now, personally, I've chosen to go the other way, just to be as stigmatized as possible, go into as many controversial topics and not shy away from anything. And I'm really glad I did, because every day I wake up, it's like freaking fascinating. Like, what am I going to learn today that's going to blow open my mind? And every day is really fascinating that day. Every day, it's amazing to what I learn. And I wouldn't have written a book like Dark Matter Monsters. And my first one was called Opening Minds for a reason. Hello. Because I went to the crop circles and we saw our batteries and cameras go out over and over, cameras and batteries failing. I could not explain that. And it wasn't until I learned more about dark matter and so forth that started to make sense what those patterns would be: funneling, channeling, lensing energy, orbs, and so forth. But anyway, it's a whole fascinating universe of phenomena out there. We should be engaging it, like Star Trek, engage.
Yeah.
when you're on the helm of the Enterprise. You engage. You don't just run away to back to the safety of your little bureaucratic cubbyhole, because that's it. I don't know. That's not who I am. That's all I'll say. So thanks for having a show like this, having all these great people on. Carter Burchard's books, by the way, are excellent. Anyone interested in Bigfoot, you have to read Carter's books. He's telling you the truth there about what he's experienced, his witnesses. Each case is more mind-blowing than the next. The gifting, the weird stuff that happens out there. You know, and Carter is so low-key.
Yeah, he comes on my show like once a month. He comes on almost.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
because you might not have heard of him if you weren't in this area. He doesn't really promote himself a lot, but his 2 books I've read so far, I'm still on the second one. They're just great accounts of people out in Arkansas, Missouri, and what they've experienced out there. He has pictures that you haven't seen on the internet.
I've got a picture that's going to be in his 3rd book that is unbelievable. I can't say what it is, and I've seen it, and I would say it might be the best evidence I've seen since the
he's the 3rd one. He's working on a 3rd book. Is that right? Right. In the book 2, I love that picture of that hand in the trail cam. These people out in Arkansas, if I'm not mistaken, had a 300-acre plot. He said nobody came out there. It's just them, 300 acres. And they started hearing the Bigfoot scene, and they put up trail cams right on the porch, and they got photos of something. There's a picture of some top of a head, a hairy head. Man, and that hand, I mean, you look at that. Okay, maybe you think it's computer generated or something. I guess I can't prove that's not what's going on, but really it looks like a kind of a gorilla human mixed something. Got the nails.
That hand one is a great piece.
Incredible. Everyone who says there's no pictures, there's no evidence. There's pictures and there's evidence. Okay.
Yeah.
By the way, this movie that I saw last year, A Flash of Beauty, Bigfoot Revealed, is an excellent Bigfoot movie. I think it's really good.
I'll check that one out.
That's a great documentary. It's the newest one, and that has a lot of good footage as far as I'm concerned. Some really good photos in there and footage that I never saw before I looked at that. And what I really liked about it at the end, Gary, is totally fits our conversation. It's a whole nother element to this. Just consider this. Their psychiatrist, psychologist interviewed at the end say, not only do people have PTSD from their cryptid encounters, they don't remember them. Your brain erases it. It's too weird. You don't have the mental, you don't have the ability to have an experience like that. Your brain doesn't want to have an experience like that. You don't want to see something that's 12 foot high that looks sort of primate-like and also human-like, and you don't know what it is. And your brain just does a delete reboot. And you end up with missing time.
Which makes sense, too, because just like sleep, it's like we disregard our dreams as, imaginary. So the brain automatically disregards 8 hours of my experience every morning when I wake up.
There you go. And there you go. I never thought about that. It's a very good analogy. Yeah, it just, you remember it the moment you wake up, but if you don't recall it pretty quickly, it fades. So it's deleting that, saying you don't need to know that. And it's doing the same thing with cryptid encounters. Because I've met people who've had these missing time encounters out in the woods. I kind of wonder what happened to them. They wonder what happened to them. It just doesn't, they're just missing time, They're back in the parking lot. I wrote about one woman in Dark Matter Monsters, Lauren. She said she was hiking with a friend in Estes Park in Rocky Mountain National Park. All of a sudden, 20 minutes into the trail, all of a sudden they're back in the parking lot. It's dark. A couple hours have gone by and they don't know what happened. And what is that? 2 people. It's happened around, I know people happen around Sasquatch encounters. They see the Sasquatch, they're about to take a picture, all of a sudden time goes by, they're back in their vehicle. They don't. So is the brain deleting it? I don't know, maybe the creatures, or I don't know. It's either all of the above, but it's an interesting area. So that's another aspect of what we were talking about. What was that?
It's certainly possible we can forget 8 hours a day of our lives.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. And it goes back to the very thing we were talking about right at the beginning of the show here. It's not just society's unwillingness to talk about this professionally. It's our own brain's desire for consistency. It's sort of that consistency bias that it is deleting experiences that it doesn't want you to remember too, that are just too strange. I think that's another possibility we have to consider, that you have mental defense mechanisms that you won't even remember what you saw,
Right.
or better or worse. And that's another aspect of this mystery. We could be having experiences, many of us could be having these, and we're not remembering it. When the cryptids would probably be laughing to themselves if they knew, they're probably doing this on purpose, and they're right out there on the street, and we're just forgetting, and they're going, like, they're right there, and we're just like, oh.
The humans, there to go, forgetting.
It'd be kind of a funny cartoon, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But again, you talk to people who have these missing time experiences. I mean, I'm not saying that's all what it is. There can be different structures of space-time that we encounter. Permittivity, you would know about that as someone were to be, electrical constants in space that can change, and that could cause space-time shifts and things, and forgetfulness, and all of this. It's very complex stuff. But again, I think if we talk about it, we'll learn. Here's what this all comes down to, since you asked me about an hour ago, why does it matter? I think we should know who we are. I think we have the right to know who we are. We live these lives, and we should have a sense of who we are and what's going on to the best of our capacity. And I don't think we'll know until we engage these topics a little more.
That's a good reason. That, and your other reason too, peace.
Sure.
Peace would be nice too.
I think that would be.
They kind of would go hand in hand, I think. I think the more we know about ourselves, the more likely we are to live peacefully.
Right.
That would be the hope, anyway.
I think it's a good idea.
So before we wrap it up, I want to thank you for coming on. It was a great interview. And where's the best place for my listeners to find you and find your books?
You can always get my books on Amazon. Opening Minds, Dark Matter Monsters, even Black Swan Ghosts, which is about these UFO witnesses I've come across, like that woman whose dad flew wreckage to Wright Pat. But you can go to my blog, newcrystalmind.com, and I have a link, and you can get signed copies of these books directly from me.
Awesome. I'll put links to all that in the notes of this episode so my listeners can find you.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks for being on.
And I have a YouTube channel, of course, and Twitter, so you can interact with that.
Awesome. I'll put links to those also.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming on. It was a great interview.
Thanks a lot, Gary. We'll talk again soon, okay?